Thanks, Bronwyn. That was really nice. Is my screen sharing okay? Everybody see my slides?
Everything looks good.
Excellent. Okay, so what I want to talk about tonight is basically what my students and I have been doing at the Natural History Society of Maryland for the past year and a half now, I think, going on. So how many of you guys, is anybody here familiar with the collections at the Natural History Society? Have any of you worked with the materials that the Natural History Society has? Or you guys mostly been involved with the tours and the events, and that's great. And I think one of the reasons that April and I talked about me coming to talk tonight is that we want the Archaeology Club to be more involved with the archaeology collections at the Natural History Society. And so I'm here to kind of give you a virtual tour of what that might consist of. So anyone who has ever worked with, a small nonprofit might know that things don't always go in a very linear fashion with how materials get taken care of, kept track of. And so the Natural History Society has a long and storied history, and what happens with the archaeology collections over that long and storied history is quite the tale. So we should take a moment here to talk a little bit about where did all of this stuff come from, and you'll see how much and what kind of stuff I'm talking about in a minute. So in the beginning, our first curator of archaeology was a man by the name of Richard Stearns, and Richard Stearns is well known throughout Maryland. He recorded many of the first archaeological sites that were recorded in Maryland. Anyone that has ever done archaeology in Maryland has come across a site that was cataloged originally by Richard Stearns. I was actually looking through the state site database today, and the first thing it said is Richard Stearns for the site I was looking at. So for 30 years, Richard Stearns served as the Curator of Archaeology at the Natural History Society of Maryland. And as is the case now, this was a volunteer position. So he was doing this in addition to his money-making job. It was not something that he was able to earn a living at. But for his time, he really put together some phenomenal records of the sites that he worked on. And I would encourage any of you, if you haven't heard Lisa Krause's lecture that she gave at the NHSM Founders Day a few years back, you can find that on NHSM's YouTube channel and watch that lecture, because she gives a great homage to Richard Stearns and the work that he's done for archaeology in the state of Maryland. So the Natural History Society used to be housed in a building in Druid Hill Park in 1936 is when they started off in that location. And so this is where they originally housed their collections. And the collections remained in that place for quite some time until they both outgrew that space and went through a period of structural problems where they had a hard time making things through financially. And one of the things that they thought about doing was handing off some of their collections to other institutions that would be able to take care of them. And then they would not have to worry about that. And one of those places, so they handed off all of their collections to various institutions, and then found out that some of said institutions were selling off their collections. Unfortunately, by then they no longer had a building, and so all of the collections were recollected, placed in boxes in a row home for about 50 years. And as you might expect, a lot of information was probably lost during that time. So fast forward to 2014 when we got the facility that you can see on Bronwyn's screen back there in Overley. And all of a sudden the unpacking could begin. So Lisa Krause and Jason Schellenhammer were the first archaeology curators that participated in the unpacking of the archaeology collections at the Natural History Society. And so if you were to go into the basement of the Overley facility, you would see a lot of cabinets that look like they do in this photo. These cabinets are all the ones that hold all of the archaeology collections. So of the total Natural History Society collections, space-wise, I would say we occupy probably 1/10 of the space, the collection storage space that is used downstairs. So it's not the biggest collection, but it's not the smallest collection either. And so Lisa and Jason, I cannot stress enough, did a phenomenal job of taking all of these materials that were dusty, in no real order, with not much in the way of labels, and taking them and trying to parse them out into meaningful units so that we could continue to figure out where all of these materials came from, what they were, if there were places that they needed to go back to, and all of those things. But any of you who know Jason and Lisa know that they are historic archaeologists. So they study anything that is post-contact, so post-arrival of Europeans. The vast majority of the materials that the Natural History Society houses are pre-contact materials. They're indigenous artifacts that are created and used by indigenous people prior to the arrival of Europeans. And there's a big difference in the type of knowledge that goes into that. Pre-contact archaeology is my area of research. And so Jason and Lisa were very welcoming when I showed up on the scene and was interested in getting involved with the collections. So this is a couple scenes from my initial involvement with the collections. Obviously, this was a while ago because my child in this photo is 3 years old now, so it's been a couple years, but this is some of the first times that I came to look at the collections. You can get an idea of what the storage situation is here. The other photos of 2 of my students. If you see the tape labels that are on each of the drawers, I would like to disabuse you of the notion that there is a great deal of information on those labels. Oftentimes they would say something like Maryland, ? Or unknown, where they would come from, or sometimes they'd have a little more information on them. So our initial job was to just get an idea of what we have. Before we could do any sort of additional research, we needed to get a general idea of how much material we had, what types of material. Are we talking about stone, pottery, bone? What types of material we're dealing with? What are the conservation issues that we might be dealing with? So that was our initial goal. The other thing that was the most important step we could take was to get a standardized system for cataloging all of the materials at the Natural History Society. Now, any of you who know various curators at the Natural History Society will probably know some curators have digital catalogs, some have paper catalogs of their materials. There's various Excel spreadsheets spread all over the place with different cataloging methods and labeling methods, but there is no one standardized set of protocols for, or one standardized database for including all of the collections at the Natural History Society. So the board put together a committee to evaluate different collections management systems and determine what would be the best fit for the Natural History Society. Having been on that committee, we had a lot of different programs we looked at. There were 2 big things that we were interested in. As you might suspect, cost was one of them, right? We're not made of money at the Natural History Society. But we also wanted something that was going to be flexible enough to fit all of the different categories of materials that we have, right? We don't just have archaeological materials, but we also have materials from pretty much every other facet of natural history as well. So we needed something that was going to be flexible enough to do that. And Arctos turned out to be a really good fit for us. There's a little bit of learning on the front end of how to use this system, but it's given us a good idea of how to get this started and continue to maintain a system. So we started on a very physical scale of just trying to determine what sort of meaningful units we could break the archaeology collections out into, not like actually break them, but separate them out into, right? So typically you'd open a drawer. It looks like the picture on the left, right? There's just a bunch of rocks in there. If you're not familiar with these materials, I can give you an idea of what kind of materials we're talking about. You're seeing things like, in this picture, I see a lot of fragments of soapstone bowls, fragments of things like hammer stones, grinding stones. Looks like there's an axe in there. So you're going to have a wide variety of different types of material, potentially from different locations. And some of them you'll see have little labels on them, which you can see in the right-hand picture. Some of the artifacts have paper labels with something written on them stuck in there. I would say approximately 1/10 of the materials in our archaeology collection we have what we call county level provenience information. And you probably all know what provenience means. Provenience means the where, right? Where did it come from? And that is probably more important to archaeologists than the what itself, right? So the artifact itself gives us a little bit of information, right? I can look at something and say, yes, this is an axe. But if I don't know where it was found, was it in a trash pit? Was it in a burial? Was it on a house floor? Was it underneath the body of a person? Or was it buried above materials that a different type of axe from an older time period, right? That gives us that contextual information that allows us to develop a nuanced interpretation of life around the axe head, right? An axe head is cool, but as archaeologists, we're not just interested in finding cool stuff. We want to use that stuff to interpret what people's lives were like. And so as much provenience information as we can have, the better, because the where and the associations around an artifact are what we use to form a cohesive story about the use life of that artifact. And more importantly, the people who used it, right? My PhD advisor always used to make fun of the fact that we would say, well, you have pottery that was made in Ohio, found in Wisconsin, right? But the pottery didn't grow legs and walk to Wisconsin, right? So the pottery, the artifacts aren't what we're really interested in. We're interested in the people who are using the artifacts. So when you lose the provenience information of an artifact, you lose a large proportion of the information that you can get about prior lifestyles from that artifact, right? If you take it out of context, you don't necessarily know what it was used for anymore. So a lot of our artifacts at the Natural History Society do not have very precise provenience, right? So if I were excavating a site today, I would be able to tell you that this particular, if I found a pen on site, I would tell you exactly the GPS coordinates, where it came from on site, and I could tell you how deep below the ground surface it was, what other materials were found in that same level, what the soil type was like where it was, and what other types of landscape features were around it. Okay, so you can get a lot more information about why that pen might have been deposited there than if I can just tell you this pen was found in Cecil County. That's it. right? So you don't necessarily have as much information to interpret how that pen might have gotten there if you don't know exactly where it came from. So the most information that we can get from most of our artifacts is that county level provenience. I would say we have one large collection that I'll talk about in a little more detail that we have site level provenience. So we know exactly which archaeological site it came from. The rest of the information, though, within that site, I can't tell you if it came from the north end or the south end, if it was collected from the surface or if it was excavated, if it was in a house or a pit or on the ground. I don't know any of that. I just know which site it came from. So we wanted to break the collection up into meaningful units. And for me, that's provenience. Where did it come from, right? So these numbers that are written on the tape separating the artifacts on this tray are the accession numbers. So I created groups based on location, right? So the 3 artifacts that have the 0019 and the arrow pointing at them, those came from one county in Arizona. It looks like I see an ARIZ written on there. So somewhere those came from Arizona. The ones next to them that have the 0025 pointing at them, it says, I think it says Tennessee, right? So, you know, you have those units, they're just broken into state units. Eventually, what you get to is this, right? So we have each artifact gets a tag like this that has a specific number associated with that artifact. So they all have that NHSM ARC prefix, and then it has a number. It's got a description of what the type of artifact is. So this would be a tag for a banner stone. It tells you where it came from. So this is Anne Arundel County. We know specifically it came from the Upper Magathie River. When it was collected, who was the person who cataloged it? Okay, so every artifact gets that tag. It goes in a bag with the artifact so that the tag cannot be separated from the artifact until the bag disintegrates, which you think might be a long time, but is actually not that long. So probably 50 years, give or take, depending on the conditions that are around the bag. So, you know, upkeep has to be maintained. You got to replace your bags occasionally, but this will keep them going for a while. So we get them separated out into discrete units. And this is important because if anyone wants to use these materials for teaching lessons, doing research, wouldn't it be nice to know where they are, right? So if you don't have any kind of system for tracking what the object is and where it is, then you can just take it, right? And use it for whatever you're using, and maybe you remember to put it back, maybe you don't. And then the only thing that is keeping track of it is your memory, which if it's like mine, it's not that good, right? So you need some sort of system to do that. So you have a digital record that is attached to each artifact. So the one that I just showed you the label for has a digital record like this, right? And you can see that on the right-hand side, it will have information like the materials that it was made out of, right? So this says this was made out of steatite. So that's the type of rock that it was made out of. You can also see that it's got information about the location, okay? And then there's also some information about the specific site that it came from. So we know exactly which archaeological site it came from. Those of you who are familiar, those are archaeological site numbers, right? So we use a tripartite numbering system in archaeology. It's called the Smithsonian trinomial system, where the first number, the 18, stands for the state. So all sites in Maryland start with 18. The second part is the county. So you have a 2-letter abbreviation for the county. So AN means, you know, it's from Anne Arundel County. And then the number at the back is the number of the site. So this is from the 257th site that was recorded in Anne Arundel County. So anytime you see a tripartite number like that, you know that you're looking at an archaeological site. And if you see the 18, you know that it's from Maryland. Pennsylvania's 36, Wisconsin's 47. Those are the only ones I have memorized. So, you know, you can tell where something's from just based on that number. And this will just tell you a little bit more about where it's located, when it was entered in the database, when that record was updated. And you can also include some information up here. So eventually we intend to take photos and have a photo of each object in the database. So the reason that that's important is because you know, I'm not the only person who needs to know where this stuff is, right? Other people are going to be using it. The curators are using it. Outside researchers are using it, student interns are using it, right? So everybody needs to be able to keep track of where these materials are so we don't lose the little information that we do have about them. And certainly so we don't lose the materials themselves. So what kind of materials are we talking about exactly, right? What is so important? Well, there's a lot of stuff. And there's a lot of random stuff that you would not expect to find at the Natural History Society of Maryland. I cannot enumerate it all for you, so I'll give you a few highlights as to what we've got hanging out in our basement. So again, provenience, variable. So sometimes you'll get a nice red tag or a blue tag, sorry, like what you see here where it just says MD, no provenience. So somewhere in the state of Maryland. Okay, we've got that much. Other times we'll know that it came from somewhere in a particular county, and then we'll know, okay, these particular artifacts that I outlined in tape are from Joppa Farm. That's a particular site. Great. Sometimes we'll just have a box that says fire pit debris. I don't know, fire pit from where? Fire pit from when? I have absolutely no idea. It's just fire pit debris. So sometimes there's documentation that you'll find with the artifacts. Sometimes it's really detailed documentation, like on the left. Arrowheads all found on Joppa Farm, Gunpowder River, Harford County, Maryland, mostly found by William B. Marie. Wonderful, thank you. Sometimes it will just say from basement, front room, under table. I do not know which basement, when, or what front table exactly that was, but I will save it forever just in case somebody who wrote that comes along and is like, oh, I remember that front table. So you never get rid of somebody else's documentation just in case somebody's going to come along and be like, no, I remember 50 years ago, I put those under a table and I wrote that on them. And I actually collected them earlier that year from Joppa Farm. Great. Okay, we're going to hold on to that just in case. So if you wonder why archaeologists are hoarders, this is why. So what is actually there, regardless of the level of documentation? We got a lot of stuff from Florida. Why Florida, you might ask? Because Richard Stearns really liked to go on vacation in Florida. So I would say a very large proportion of the materials that we have were collected by Richard Stearns on various vacations. And if you look through, again, watching Lisa Krause's presentation on Stearns and the work he did for the Natural History Society, you will see him dragging his wife and children on a lot of family vacations to shell mounds. She tells a great story about, and she interviewed Richard Stearns's children about this. She tells a great story about them going and stopping at an active construction site that they were passing on the side of the road. And Stearns asking if he could look through the dirt that they had just excavated out of there because he thought it was a site. So this is what you get when you're in the family of an archaeologist, or these types of random vacations. This is also what you get when that's your curator. So Stearns would bring back tons of potsherds from Florida. These are all pieces of pre-contact pottery. even more Florida. A lot of these drilled conch shells. I got to talk to a great archaeologist who's working in DC right now, Dr. David Thulman. He was actually the one that ran the merit badge for the Natural History Society, the Boy Scout merit badge. Dave Thulman was involved with that. And he was telling me that these were commonly used as hoes for gardening. So you would drill a hole, stick your handle through the hole, attach it with some twine, and that would be your garden hoe. So if you did not live in Florida, then you would not have thought of that because you didn't just have conch shells laying around to use as a hoe. So where I did my PhD research in the Midwest, people used deer's scapula. So we didn't have conch shells. You would use the shoulder blade of a deer. You've got some slate that's been drilled. It's got a nice hole drilled in the middle there, which is pretty cool. And of course, more pottery. Classic in a cigar box. Cigar box is very well used by archaeologists as a storage method. Among the other things that you would not expect to see in Maryland is Casas Grandes pottery. And this is one of the highlights of the Natural History Society's collections. If you come to the museum, you will actually get to see some of this on display. These are some of the materials that are on display there. So Casas Grandes pottery mostly comes from Chihuahua, Mexico, especially the Pacome site, which is a UNESCO site. It's not the only Casas Grandes site. Obviously, you cannot go to a UNESCO site now and take pottery from it. Do not think that you can do that. But when Stearns was collecting, not so much of an issue. And so we have these really incredible, complete Casas Grandes pottery that date to anywhere from AD 700 to 1500 from this region. Similarly, we also have a pretty large collection of Cherokee pottery at the Natural History Society. This is from Panama, and again, similar age to Casas Grandes, 700 to 1550. So we've got both whole pots and these fragments that you can see here that are primarily handles. So a little bit closer to home, we start to get a little bit more information about our collections. All right, so this is a small collection that we actually had some documentary evidence for, and it was collected by a man who is only described as E.E. Brown. He was born in 1870, served in the US Army. He had, this is a great amount of detail, a BA in agriculture from Purdue. And then after he got his degree, he worked as a land appraiser. And while he was out appraising land, he was looking in the farm fields that he was appraising for artifacts and collected all over Iowa, Indiana, and Ohio. And then, as often happens with private artifact collections, he passed away. The collection passed on to his children. His children didn't know what the heck to do with it, and it was donated to the Natural History Society by his son, Robert, in 2017, which is why we have as much information as we do about the collection. So a lot of this provenience information is all word of mouth passed down from generation to generation. So here we've got a grooved axe. From left to right, you've got a celt, which is kind of a smaller version of an axe, a scraper for doing something like hide scraping, and a couple, projectile points. So in my personal opinion, which may be a little biased, the crown jewel of the Natural History Society collections is the material that Stearns collected from the Conowingo site. And I won't go into too much detail about Conowingo, but if you're interested, feel free to shoot me an email. One of my students and I published an article earlier this year on the NHSM collections from Conowingo. it's a really cool site. In fact, I was just looking at a lot of material from Conowingo in another collection recently, and I continue to be amazed by the sheer quantity of material from this site. There must have been a lot of people living there over a long period of time. Most of the materials from Conowingo date to the Archaic period. So we're talking a few thousand years ago. And one of the coolest things about Conowingo, I think, is the large ground stone production industry. So here, these are pictures of banner stones. Full disclosure here, archaeologists don't 100% know what banner stones were used for. The most common interpretation is that they were used as spear thrower weights. So if you're familiar with the atlatl or spear thrower, right, it's a little basically wooden shaft that's got a hook in the end, and you fit that hook into the end of a long, usually 5 or 6 foot long dart, looks like a giant arrow, and then you use that to expand your ability to throw with greater force and for greater distance. You can expand that even further by weighting your atlatl, your spear thrower. And so we think that that's what people are doing. What we don't often, so we often find broken, finished banner stones. What we don't often find are what we call preforms, so those early stages of producing a banner stone. So from left to right here, you have the earliest stage of producing a banner stone, right? It looks pretty rough, okay, right? They haven't done much here to shape it. They've just taken a couple chips off the outside. And then during this stage, they did what's called pecking, where they took a small stone and they just hit it a lot for a really long time. I've done this. Takes an unfortunate amount of time, and knocked it into the rough shape that they want, got their edges smoothed down a little more. And then once they got it into the shape that they want, they did the drilling part of it. So there's a hole right through the middle right here that they drilled through the middle. I think that that is probably the most common breakage time when banner stones broke. You would expect that, right? Anyone who's ever done any kind of drilling of anything really, but especially stone, it's most likely to break during that drilling stage when you're trying to split it. So after that stage, then the only thing that they would do to further finish it is by polishing it. So Conowingo is really unique in just the sheer quantity of material that has come from the site, as well as the types of material. So it provides a really great example of what we can use these collections for. So Conowingo in particular has provided us with a lot of research opportunities. This is a picture of me with 2 of my students working on analyzing the ground stone collections from Conowingo. This is the article that I published with one of my students, the one with the blue hair, and they also presented this research. They were the student paper that presented at the Archaeological Society of Maryland Spring Symposium this year. So it's really provided a lot of opportunities for student involvement and student research, and that's been a really great thing for everybody. The NHSM collections also really make a wonderful teaching tool. So as I mentioned, I'm at Towson University. There's a student archaeology club at Towson, and my students regularly use some of the materials from the NHSM collections to do outreach events. Twice a year, we do a pop-up museum on campus where students can come by, learn about the materials. The archaeology club members at TU are the ones teaching them about them. So it's a great learning experience for both my students who are doing the teaching and non-archaeology students who are just wandering by. And these are also things that we can use in the classroom. I threw in this random picture of the spade because this is my favorite artifact from the Natural History Society. So I have an unnatural love of stone hoes, and that's because my area of expertise is the study of use wear on stone tools. So you can microscopically look at stone tools to figure out exactly what material they were used on. Different types of material, you leave different traces. So as you might expect, right, if I scratch this pen on a piece of meat as opposed to a wooden table, it's going to produce some different wear on the pen, right? It's going to get more worn down if I scratch it on a hard material like a wooden table. It's going to get all greasy if I scratch it on a piece of meat, right? So the same thing happens if you're using stone tools. Those traces stick around for thousands and thousands of years. You look at them under a microscope and you can see them. Nothing produces polish like using a hoe to scrape through dirt, though, because of the silica in the dirt. So you can see if you look at the working end of this hoe, all of the polish there, see how it's kind of shiny like porcelain. And it's really obvious if you look at the flake scars. So if you know anything about how stone tools are made, right, you make them by knocking flakes off of the core, the large piece of rock, to make it into the shape that you want. It's a reductive process. And so here you can see that this isn't polished, right? That area in that little flake scar isn't polished. And that's because they used the heck out of this hoe, and then this little flake popped off and they didn't use it much after that. And you can see the difference between this surface and that surface. And so whenever I'm teaching students about use wear, I show them this hoe because it's a really good example of that. So they make fantastic teaching tools. So some of the many of the collections at the Natural History Society are not ideal for research because we don't have that provenience, right? But they are so unique in the areas that they come from, and they're in such large numbers. The former state archaeologist of Maryland had a great quote at a meeting I was at recently, and he was just like, I've never found a ground stone axe in the field in 30 years of doing archaeology in Maryland. And I think it's because Richard Stearns picked them all up. And we do have a crap ton of ground stone axes that, as a field archaeologist, you don't find artifacts like this in the field anymore. And so it's a really unique opportunity when students get to work with these collections and the public writ large. They do come with some ethical concerns though, right? So you're always worried when you find a sign like this in the collections where it says Indian grave. Do I know that this sign was associated with this pottery? Not really, right? I don't know exactly where this sign came from. Was this pottery in the grave that someone made this sign about, or was that about something else? Why do we have a sign about a grave, right? So there are some ethical concerns about the materials that we keep. And that's one of the reasons that it is so important for us to catalog what we have. And then, as we are in the process of doing right now, initiate the process of being in compliance with federal laws like the Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act, which is abbreviated NAGPRA, if you've ever heard of that, which was enacted in 1990, that requires all institutions that receive federal funding or are federal or materials that are found on federal land to be inventoried, for an inventory to be filed with the National NAGPRA program, and for consultation with any interested and affiliated tribes to be held. And if affiliation can be determined, that those materials are then returned to the tribes, repatriated to them. So this is one of the core reasons why it's so important to figure out what we have, and especially where it came from, because then we can have a better idea of who made these things, right? You can't give something back if you don't know who made it. So as much information as we can gather about that is really important. And it's important to be in collaboration with the indigenous peoples in Maryland, because these are their tribal heritage, right? And just because they were collected before laws like the Archaeological Resources Protection Act or NAGPRA were enacted, does not mean that we should continue to hold on to them in a basement where people don't get to see them anyway, right? So the tribes would say that we need to make sure that we are working with them on how these materials should be kept, if they should be kept, and what should be done with them, and what stories we tell about them. So as I talk about what we've done with the collections thus far, I don't want you to think that we're done. It's never done, right? So I was in the basement shortly before I made this presentation, and I was in the geology area because I was trying to figure out how many cabinets we would need if we were going to rehab our entire collection space. And lo and behold, I just found this entire cartload of soapstone bowls hanging out in the geology area, right? So it is an ongoing process. It is always a process, especially because this stuff hasn't even been unpacked for more than 6 years, right? We have a long way to go. If people ask me about how much of the archaeology collections we have cataloged to date, I would say about 15%. And we've got about 1,500 artifacts cataloged thus far. Okay, so there's always more work to do with getting a handle on what we have, and we can refine those records more. So that being said, we owe a lot to people who have been working on this collection, who accumulated the collection. So especially Richard Stearns and his family, who has made a lot of information available to us, and that we really appreciate. I in particular want to acknowledge the work that Lisa Krause and Jason Schellenhammer have done. None of this would be possible without the preliminary work that they did with the collections, and also for their consistent working with me during this process. We're still in regular communication about the materials at NHSM because they have that institutional memory. And then especially to my students at TU who are getting a great learning experience for what it is really like working at a museum, because I have worked at much larger institutions than the Natural History Society of Maryland, and the problems aren't different. They're just bigger, that's all, right? So we run into the same issues of not knowing where things came from, having poor recordation, having to consult multiple people to figure out where they came from. And that's part of the gig, right? So as many people as you can involve in that process, then the collection gets to be a living entity again, where you're constantly accumulating new information. And passing that information on to the general public is a big part of the importance of that. So that's my spiel. Any questions at all?
Wow, thank you, Kat. I love this. I always want to know what's going on down there, and this really shined a light on here. You can unshare a little bit.
Yeah,
and I'm
for sure.
so impressed with the work that you and your students have been doing thus far with the collections. It's wonderful. Thank you so much. It looks like Ilka has a question about repatriating artifacts to Mexico and Panama.
That's a great question, Ilka. So initially that was what Jason and Lisa and I had intended. And I've gotten some advice from the archaeological community writ large since then. And I think that it's very good to consider that Mexico and Panama have their hands full with the amount of artifacts that they already have from these sites. So our current intent is to inform them that the Antiquities Administration in both countries, that we have these materials. If they would like them back, they may have them. But unless they request them back, then we're going to hold on to them, because it's a really unique opportunity for people to engage with them in a way that they wouldn't normally be able to at a larger museum.
I have a question also. Do you have a process in place for, we get calls all the time, and maybe some other people are here, they have things at their house and they want to donate it to the collections. What do they do about that, or not do?
That's a great question. So, and everyone will have a different answer for that. So I can tell you right now that the NHSM board is working to put together, we have a committee right now that is establishing a collections policy. And what that policy will consist of is a statement on the types of material that we are interested in receiving, the condition that material would need to be in, and then procedures for additionally things like incoming and outgoing loans, gifts, what the storage requirements would be, anything like that. So as of right now, we do not have a statement that says these are the types of collections that we're interested in having. I would beg you to not bring any more cigar boxes of something that you don't know where it's from, because we already have so many of those. But you know, if you have something that you say, look, my grandfather collected this from this field, and I know exactly where all of this stuff came from, then that's something that is a lot more valuable for archaeological research. In particular, NHSM is really only interested in stuff that's coming from Maryland, because we really have to focus. One of the things that makes archaeological collections different from other natural history collections like fossils or you know, mammal specimens or anything like that is when you have too many of those, you can sell them, you can give them away. Heck, you can even put them in the dumpster. There is no sort of ethical, you know, conundrum involved with that. That's not the case for archaeological collections. Currently, the federal government does not even have a policy for what we call the deaccession of collections, which is what do you do with collections you want to get rid of? Because we archaeologists don't know what to do about that. So when we take on a collection, we have the ethical responsibility to curate it in perpetuity forever. And that's a lot of cigar boxes to curate forever. So we have to, as much as we might not want to, we have to be selective about the projects that we take on, because we do have to keep them forever. There's no way to deaccession them at this time. We don't have a deaccession policy, and even the federal government does not have a recommendation for deaccessioning.
And I know that some of the pieces of the collections that went to different places, like the whale skeleton is somewhere in North Carolina, and I'm trying to get it back.
Yeah.
Do we know where any of the other parts of the collection are? Is there an opportunity to get them back, or are they just gone?
We don't know. I know that some things went to the Maryland Center for History and Culture. I don't know if they still have them or not. I know that some things went to the Maryland Science Center. Don't know if they still have them or not. honestly, if anything has gone to the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab, which is the MAC lab, some of you might be familiar because you guys went on a field trip there earlier this year, I think. If you went on the field trip, you know how amazing the MAC lab is. I don't want to get anything back from the MAC lab. They do an amazing job at that facility. And honestly, this is one of the things that Jason and Lisa and I would like to see is that a lot of any of the site level collections that we have, those go to the MAC lab. Because so especially the Conowingo collection, the MAC lab already curates thousands of artifacts from Conowingo from other people's investigations at that site. So we'd really like to reunite those, send them to an institution so that when someone wants to do research on the Conowingo site, they don't have to come to NHSM, to the MAC lab, to the Maryland Science Center, because the collection from that site is split up over all of these different institutions. So it's our goal to eventually, these collections that we have site level provenience on, we'd like to get them up to MAC lab standards, inventoried, and then donated to the MAC lab for long-term curation. And then we can concentrate more on things that will serve as teaching collections that don't have a lot of provenience, but because they don't have a lot of provenience, they don't have a lot of research value. So that means, okay, we can set them out for people to touch and look at, and it's not as big of a deal.
All right.
Adrian, I see a comment in the chat there about that 2 grooves on the last axe. I think he sent that just to me, so I'll mention that briefly. So if you look at, I'm going to share my screen again really quick here. So the last picture I had up was an axe that has 2 grooves on it from Conowingo. I've seen those other places before. In fact, Adrian, I've seen one in your basement, but they're pretty rare. So, and one of the interesting things about this axe is that they didn't do a lot to modify the body of the axe. So they packed these 2 grooves in the axe that you can see there. They look a little bit rougher than the rest of the axe. All right, so there's 1 groove there and another groove there. And then they pecked this area at the bit end, the chopping end, to make it pointier. And then they just stopped. They're like, all right, I'm not going to work on this anymore. So these areas that I did not circle that look a little bit smoother, right here and right here, and the area between the 2 grooves, they never touched, right? They didn't bother to modify those areas at all. And so I don't think that they ended up using this one. I think it doesn't, sure as heck didn't make the end very sharp. But even and it doesn't look like there's much damage to the end of it to suggest that it was used. So if you would have a double grooved axe, the grooves are where the haft, the handle, fits onto the axe head. So a double grooved axe would just have a very sturdy handle. You'd have 2 areas where the hafting element went around it. But I think they just started this one and didn't finish it. So we only have 1 double grooved axe in the NHSM collections, and I think it's pretty cool. So that's why I stuck that picture in there.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Because I do, but I'll let other people ask a question.
Yeah.
You can raise your hand and unmute, and I'll call on you if you have a question, or put it in the chat box. All right, one more question from me, I think.
Yeah.
You mentioned, well, 2 more questions. One is, you mentioned that in the profile that you do for each of the specimens, you are putting the material that it's made out of.
Yes.
So do archaeology students do they take geology classes to better understand the materials? And are you working with the geology curators to confirm or the materials as well as their cross pollination there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So do they take geology classes? Not usually. Is it helpful? Absolutely. So my husband's also an archaeologist, and his first degree is in geology. And so if I have questions, I'll go to him usually. But my area of expertise is in stone tools. And as you might expect, because provenience is so important, right? One of the questions we often have is, where did they get the rock to make this tool from, right? Was it in their backyard or was it 300 miles away, right? That tells us a lot about the people that were producing these tools, right? Were they going a long way or trading a long way, or were they focusing only on local stuff? So it's important for archaeologists to know local types of rock and where things outcrop, where they don't. Anyone who's done archaeology in this area can tell you a lot of projectile points, arrowheads, spearheads, are made out of quartz. There is a lot of quartz around here. That's why it was easily accessible. Is it because it was easy to flint knap? Absolutely not. I was just flint knapping some quartz the other day, and it was very sharp, but it doesn't break very predictably at all, right? So the type of material is something that's really important. I have a reference collection that I set up for my students with drawers of all of the most common materials that they would find in this area. So, I would say 80% of the time they can slot the materials into one of those comparatives. So between a flow chart that has them say, does it have these characteristics? Are there small fossils embedded in the surface? Yes, no. If there are, go to number, it's like a choose your own adventure of figure out what this rock is. So between the flow chart and the reference collection, students get the hang of doing the IDs pretty quickly. And I check their IDs for the first couple hundred.
Okay, wonderful. And then the other question is, the database itself, will that be public? And will people be able to go on and see, or is it public now, or is that the plan?
That's a great question. I don't think it's public yet, but so if you Googled Arctos right now, there are lots. So it's not just us that uses it, it's a consortium of multiple organizations around the country that use it. A lot of bigger institutions. So for instance, University of Alaska's Museum of Culture uses it. Denver Museum of Nature and Science uses it. That's the State Natural History Museum in Colorado. So there are some really big organizations, and then there are some smaller organizations, even smaller than Natural History Society of Maryland by far. And so one of the advantages of using a system like that is you have a consortium of people that are kind of constantly making updates. There's a working group that meets virtually once a month to talk about issues with the database. And so they're maintaining it a lot more than some of the kind of out-of-box collections management systems that don't get updated more often than once every 5 or 10 years. So Arctos is kind of a living, working organism. So one of the great things about it is, yeah, you can search any of those institutions. Now, as the institutional administrator, we can decide which records are publicly accessible and which ones are not. So for instance, if we have culturally sensitive materials that we don't want to be publicly searchable on the database, right? That's one of our agreements with the tribes. If we're going to continue to curate particular materials, then we can say, okay, those aren't publicly accessible. Someone would have to email me and ask me for access to those records. But most of our collections, yes, they'll be publicly searchable.
Any other questions while we have her?
I think Steve's got a hand up. Nope, that's my hand. Haha. It was my little hand icon over top of his box. Thanks, Ilka. I appreciate the feedback. Good feedback. I took a little break from the collections management at NHSM this summer to work on like 10,000 other projects. But yeah, I have several students that will be back to inventorying this fall. So our hope is to have the archaeology collections done in 2 years at the most, 2 more years from now. The more of you who are interested in participating, the faster it will go. So feel free to let me know if that's the case.
That's right. I was just going to say the same thing. The Natural History Society is all volunteer organization, so it's a really, really wonderful way to do some practical work in a field, in a topic that you are passionate about. So you can definitely get involved and make a really, really big difference.
Sounds like a good archaeology club event to plan.
Yeah, I'm perfectly happy, April and or Ilka, we can chat about when would be a good time to do that. And, we could all meet up at the facility in Overly and do a little group session. That's fine.
Sounds good.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and most thanks to Dr. Sterner, Kat, for sharing with us all the wonderful, amazing work that she's been doing with the collections, and leading the way for the other collections as well, bringing us into the 21st century so that the collections, we understand them more, we can better utilize them, and they can be used by many other people.
Thanks. Yeah, they're amazing collections. It's a privilege to get to work with them. So yeah, you guys have a real gem here. So I'm happy to anytime we can figure out a time for the archaeology club to actually get their hands into what NHSM's just got hanging around for you guys.
Oh yeah, there's never been a better time to be involved with the natural history collections, because they're going back and finding so many amazing things that are in a cigar box or just with DNA with other specimens. So it's a fascinating time for natural history collections all over the world.
Yeah. Well, thank you, everybody. And
Thank
take
you.
care. Hopefully I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Have a good night.